Great. Hello, and welcome to our first Cambridge Disaster Research Network, or CDRN, seminar of the term. We're so excited to be here. For those of you who are new and haven't joined us for seminars before, CDRN is a network for those interested in disasters and natural hazards from departments both across the University of Cambridge and beyond. Our objective is to connect hazard and disaster research and researchers across disciplines and to link academic approaches to the needs and experiences of practitioners. I'm Ellen Kuyava. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography here in Cambridge, and I'm joined by Ainsley Trahan. This is an exciting term for CDRN as we're in a period of convener transition. We're super grateful to our outgoing convener team, and we're excited to introduce some new faces later in the term. Today is our keynote seminar of this term, and we're excited to welcome Terry Cannon. Terry is a longtime contributor to CDRN. You've probably seen his face before, and he's one of the co-authors of the seminal disaster text, At Risk, Natural Hazards, People's Vulnerability, and Disasters, which I'm sure is on many of our desks, including mine. Terry is an emeritus fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and a senior visiting lecturer in the Department of Geography at King's College London. His research interests center on rural livelihoods, disaster vulnerability, and climate change adaptation. And he does very well what many of us aspire to do, which is bridging the gap between academic research and practice. Terry will be talking with us today about intersecting injustices and competing narratives for climate change, bad news for disaster preparedness. We'll follow our usual format today. Terry will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to discussion. Please do hold your questions until then, though you're welcome to put them in the chat so that they don't escape your mind. Terry has also mentioned to us that he's glad to accept questions and comments by email after this talk. And we're really looking forward to hearing from him. Terry, would you like to go ahead and share your slides?
Sure. I'll share my slides. Is that all right?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's probably rather a strange title, and it's quite a difficult topic. And so my request for you to send comments and questions afterwards is really genuine, because I do want to get feedback on this before I try to write it up for some form of publication. So basically what I'm challenging is the entire way in which climate change is dealt with within the international political system, within the UN frameworks and so on. So it won't take long to fix that, but it's kind of, well, of course, it's actually, I think, impossible to fix it. But what I want to do is to kind of explore the ideas and see what we might think of what needs to be done about it. So the problem is this: carbon emissions. These are just from fossil fuel in industry. And you can see they really start to go up after 1950 as fossil fuel burning becomes much, much more predominant. And this is a typical view which assigns the emissions to countries, or in some cases regions like the European Union. And you'll see that by the end of the 20th century, China comes out as the lead country, which, as you might be aware, was something which wrecked the Copenhagen COP in 2009. We can come back to that if you're interested. But the key point I want to use with this slide is to show how the whole framework is faced around the relations between countries. And I think that this is wrong. I think it should be about class and elites, and the difference not between rich, so-called rich and so-called poor countries, but between the rich in all countries and the poor in all countries. If we look at emissions in terms of income groups, you can see that the top 1% of the global income group burns 15% of the emissions. And between them and the next 9%, is well over 1/3. It's nearly half of the global emissions can be attributed to the top 10% of the global population. Now, of course, many of that top 10% are in the so-called global north, but many of them are in the global south as well. And I think it's really, this is in terms of per capita emissions, but I think I want to extend that argument to be much more about elites generally, and especially corporations and governments that support those corporations. So the normal response to climate change is around this framework of actions, if you like, within the international system. So the first challenge for action was to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, which began from the very start of the international discussions within the UN and so on around 1988. And of course, that has to be a crucial part, getting to so-called net zero as quickly as possible. But we also know that adaptation has to take place, preparing to deal with the effects of climate change. And that really only becomes significant in 2005. What's interesting about this division is that if net zero is achieved, even if it's in 2040 or 2050, of course that matters, but in a sense it doesn't matter so much as how we deal with adaptation, because the entire population of the world, of course, will have to adapt, and that process of adaptation will be going on for more than 100 years, because emissions are put to zero does not mean that adaptation is no longer necessary, because the climate has changed and it will carry on changing. And my own focus in this then is on poorer people, especially farmers and those with and without land, who are mostly in the so-called global south. And that is the kind of thing which is not adequately discussed. So I have a second paper related to this one, which is much more on that question, which I won't have time to deal with today. Now, we also know that in the international negotiations, they are subject to external criticism and the action of civil society. So we know that those who proposed that emissions from deforestation were important managed to get onto the agenda in 2005, the RED Plus agenda. And we also know that the pressure on loss and damage began. And so that arrived on the agenda in 2010, with a fund being set up, I think 3 years ago in Glasgow, in which there is no money to speak of. Adaptation money, there's very, very little money as well. I'm not going to discuss that, that's in my other paper, but I just want everyone to be aware that what I'm talking about today is in this bottom half of the diagram. It's about the problems of how the international system will or will not deal with 100 years of adaptation and loss and damage. Now, the problem, as I see it, is that I've just got to adjust my screen for a minute, is that we have two narratives. Now, they're based around the idea of justice, and the predominant one is about the relations between countries. And it's because I think we've been guilt-tripped into the idea that the emissions come from the so-called global north, the rich countries, and have to be dealt with as something that has been caused by those countries. The negative effects, of course, are global, but they have their greatest effect on poor countries and poor people, and vulnerable people in those places. And so the justice argument requires allowing poor countries to burn more fossil fuels to enable their people to enjoy so-called development, which actually is, generally speaking, equated with economic growth, which we know does not necessarily reduce poverty. And also the justice argument suggests that rich countries provide finance to poor countries to help them to adapt and even to pay for loss and damage. Now, this entire framework narrative around the relations between countries is what has got us into the mess, as I hope I will illustrate as we go on. I prefer instead a focus on class, on elites and exploitation in all countries. And the reason for this, I think, will become evident as I go on. The emissions can be accounted through fossil fuel corporations and governments, the governments that allow them to operate, instead of allocating them to countries. And we also need to realize that climate change is not the cause of why people are already poor and vulnerable. They've been poor and vulnerable for a very long time. And what I want to question is what happens when climate change becomes equated with being a cause of poverty and vulnerability, because the explanation of existing poverty goes out the window. Of course, existing poverty makes people more vulnerable to climate change, but it didn't cause their initial poverty. And although climate change will increase the number of poor people by hundreds of millions because of the systems of power they live in, the existing reasons for poverty will not go away. And so to focus on climate change as a cause of poverty or of increasing disasters, because I realize this is a predominantly network that's interested in extreme events and so on, we all understand how the disasters are socially constructed. So I'm extending that argument to the poverty, the vulnerability that is generated already within these systems of power, and how they will be exacerbated by global warming. But if climate change is blamed, then it lets the governments and the elites and business corporations to escape from their responsibilities in causing poverty, allowing poverty to exist, and in justifying further extraction of fossil fuels to supposedly help end that poverty through, quote, development. So it's a very different kind of narrative, but it's a justice narrative. It's a justice narrative that takes away from the idea that it's about countries towards corporations, elites, and those who are in control of politics and the economy. Now, if we look at so-called poor countries, we know that most of them, not all, were colonized. And we know that wealth was extracted from them, sometimes over centuries, with a well-established understanding of colonization. What is less acknowledged now is that in most of the anti-colonial and national liberation movements, which operated in the run-up to gaining independence, and this begins in the 19th century in India and in Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries, most of those movements were anti-imperialist, but they were also about elite classes. Now, most of the anti-colonial and liberation movements actually had the goal of setting up a new system that would not be dominated by corporations and elites. Of course, some of them were pro-communist or were actually communist, as in China or Vietnam, but many of those in Africa tried to invoke ideas of African socialism, indigenous ideas of sharing, and not allowing enormous amounts of wealth to be accumulated by a minority. Those leaders, in many of the non-communist ones, were replaced by coups or by assassinations of their leaders, so that, for example, in most of Africa, there are now demagogues, kleptocrats, or others who are milking the climate change narrative, especially around extracting more fossil fuels, which I will come back to later. Now, the colonial systems of exploitation, especially around land tenure, were taken over by these new post-independence elites for their own benefit. This is very evident in South Asia, in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which, if I have time, I'll come to with a case study later on. So the question for us to be understood what's going on is what share of today's poverty can be explained by past colonization. In other words, if you were to look at Tanzania or Bangladesh today, would you say that people are poor in those countries because they were exploited when they were occupied by Britain, or in Tanzania's case, earlier on by Germany? So what is the explanatory power of empire to understand existing poverty? And I would say it is extremely small. I would argue that most of the poverty today can be attributed to the behavior of the existing elite, which has in part inherited systems of exploitation which were handed to them by the colonial powers, which they have manipulated and used themselves. So then we need to understand what share of current poverty is due to international exploitation, what is sometimes called neocolonialism, for example, through multinational corporations and so on. Now, of course, these are very significant, but I would say that probably well below 50% of poverty is caused by these international transfers of wealth between so-called poor and rich countries. But thinking about it, this is often happening when there is an alliance between the domestic elite in those countries and the external elite. And so we need to understand, well, what is going on in terms of the class basis, the corporate basis of the way in which that existing international neocolonialism is taking place. And what I would argue is that governments in the so-called poor countries find it very easy, very convenient to blame climate change and the rich countries rather than their own action and inaction in doing something about the poverty of their people. And I'll try to sustain that argument as I go on. I would also argue that this rich-poor country categorization is very misleading. I think you will have seen why that might be the case already. I would argue, firstly, that European colonization was class-based. It was not a nation exploiting a nation. The elite in India continued to do very well, thank you very much. And the benefits of colonization in Britain were very restricted to a very small minority of the people in Britain. And poor people in the supposedly rich countries had very little benefit in terms of higher income and wealth or welfare, for example, health, during the period of the peak British Empire or European empires. We also know that some countries became very wealthy without having colonies, for example, Switzerland and Sweden. So a proper analysis, which is not driven by guilt of having been part of the colonial process, requires an explanation of how this happened as well, without those countries having formal colonies. We also know that other countries that had large empires, European countries, Spain and Portugal are the predominant ones, also did not become rich or capitalist. They were regarded as the poor men of Europe until relatively recently. And that, in my view, again, is because they did not develop a capitalist elite. They transferred feudalism to Latin America, and it continued to mesh in with the feudal elite in Spain and Portugal, rather than those countries having a transition to capitalist industrialism. We also know that some poor countries were never formally colonized, for example, Ethiopia, Thailand, and Nepal. So we also need to explain their poverty in relation to either international relations or what is going on in those countries with their own systems of power themselves. We also know that some so-called poor countries, as they're called today, were themselves empires: India, China, Ethiopia, Indonesia. And I think what is another problem of the first narrative I'm using, the relations between countries, is that it enables the disguising of the fact that many countries in other parts of the world are also or were empires in themselves. So the binaries between country types can be very misleading. Using European empires as the basis of rich and poor disguises the class basis of those empires. It ignores all other empires that existed and still exist because of the guilt framework that is put on us as supporters of development or as supporters of doing something about climate change and disaster risk reduction. It tends to guilt trip us into thinking we are part of the problem for being part of the colonial process, and hence a lot of the guilt around decolonizing development, etc., which we can go into in the discussion. And as I'm arguing, for climate change, this guilt context is very convenient because it enables the governments of the Global South to avoid their responsibility for being part of the cause of poverty and vulnerability to disasters. And the narrative pushes responsibility on governments and individuals, not corporations or elites. So the binary is between countries, north, south, or rich and poor, rather than between classes. And I think this is extremely, well, it is already dangerous and is going to carry on being dangerous. And I think that corporations and elites are very clever in diverting policy away from their behavior and onto approaches that avoid, for example, carbon taxes, which would have a serious impact on reducing emissions. And they avoid any serious control on their profit-seeking behavior, as we've seen in the last 4 years with the super profits they made around COVID and the war in Ukraine, and so on. And we also know, and it's been in the press the last few weeks, that oil and gas companies in the UK are rapidly reversing their commitments to reduce fossil fuel extraction. And we know that the Democratic Party is much more friendly to fossil fuel than is needed for achieving net zero. So, and we find that in many countries of the so-called Global South, they support fossil fuels as a means for enabling development of their people. And I would question that. I think they're acting as elites around profit-seeking, where they can use the excuse that extracting the fuels will benefit their people. I think this is fake and serves their own interests rather than their people's interests. I'll use the example of Nigeria to illustrate that in a minute. But the first point is around the idea that, I haven't lost the slides, it's okay, I've just blanked them. The idea that the empire caused rich countries, that the rich countries are rich because they were part of the empire. These are slides of Britain at the height of the British Empire, around 1990, poverty in different parts of Britain. And this is a workhouse, which was one of the main pillars of dealing with poverty in, well, actually for a very long time. They only stopped operating in the 1930s in England. And as you can see, hundreds of people were put into workhouses. This one in the center of London, this one also in the center of London, with hundreds of people who sought refuge in the poorhouses when they could not afford to literally to pay rent or to buy food. And we also know, quite interesting, that here is the recruitment for soldiers to go into the First World War. And they're pitching this around the maintaining honor and glory of the British Empire, which is quite extraordinary. 40% of the men who volunteered were rejected for medical reasons because they were unhealthy and unfed. They were stunted in their height compared with those who got better nutrition. And it was regarded as an embarrassment. How could such an unhealthy population manage the British Empire? And I think this is where we get the interface between the class base of the British Empire and the desire to maintain the empire using people who were not fit because the empire was not giving them a decent income. And I think this is why we can see that the binary between rich and poor countries is not very helpful at all. Most extraordinary is the Boer War, which came before the First World War, where, as you can see in the yellow extract here, the poor health of the British people, arguing that malnourished and unhealthy nation could not rule the biggest empire of the world. Here on the right, you see some of the Dutch farmers who were resisting British goals in the Boer War. I knew nothing about the war. I still know very little about it, but I was absolutely astonished as I updated these slides today that, I mean, this is a war we hardly ever hear about. The total number of soldiers on the British side in this war was 400,000. Getting on for 500,000 soldiers were in South Africa fighting against the Dutch settlers for British supremacy in South Africa. Quite extraordinary story. But they couldn't find the healthy ones that they needed, so they recruited from the British colonies, from Canada, India, and other parts of the empire to come and fight, as they did in the First World War. So here is the divide between, this is supposedly a rich country. You can see that in 1900, the bottom 50% of the population on the blue line had no wealth whatsoever. And even up to the present day, it is still only 5%. This is savings, stocks, bonds, savings, or housing, the value of your house. Whereas the top 10% at the time of the empire being at its prime had 90% of the wealth. Now, of course, it came down over the course of that century, but you'll see that it goes up after 1990 with the espousal of neoliberal policies, which favored wealth and inequality over taxation and greater distribution of wealth. This is the actual income one. The previous one was wealth. This is income. You'll see that in 1900, half the British population had only less than 15% of the population. It rose a bit with interventions for better life and tax transfers. And you can see that the wealth of the top 10% came down as a result of the income tax process. But you see that after Thatcher, the top 10%, their income share goes up to around 35% in recent years. So gross inequality overseen by different governments and allowed. And so we're talking about rich countries, poor countries, when in the negotiations around climate change, half the British population is not rich. They only have 20% of the income of Britain. Now, the reason that income could improve over that period of that century was because of taxation, progressive taxation systems. And this is the top marginal rate of taxation for UK, US, and Germany. And you can see that in the middle of the century, until neoliberalism, Thatcher Reaganomics comes in the 1980s, that top rate of taxation was very high. So if you look at the orange line, the top rate of British tax was 97%. So if you earned over, I'm afraid I can't remember what the threshold was, but let's assume that in today's terms, it might have been around £150,000 a year. Anything that you earned over £150,000 a year, you only kept 3% of it. The other 97% went to the revenue, and that paid for the welfare. It paid for the National Health Service. It paid for schools, and so on. And you can see that this is coinciding with what was called welfare capitalism during that period when there was redistribution of wealth. And here is neoliberalism, when all of those marginal rates of taxation went down. You might remember that Liz Truss 3 years ago tried to cancel the 45% rate in England. So the current marginal rate of taxation for the richest is 45% now, compared with 97% 60 years ago. Now, if we look at India on the other side of the so-called rich countries, poor countries divide, we can see, I haven't got the data back to the beginning of the century for wealth. Here's the top 10% of the Indian population have now, and it's gone up under their liberalization regimes, is gone up to 65%. 10% of the Indian population gets 65% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% has gone down. So we can see here that rapid economic growth, which has been very true of India, in the last 20 years, their average rate of economic growth per annum has been, I think, between 5 and 8%. Not as high as China has claimed, but still one of the highest rates in the world. And poverty has increased. The bottom 50% have got less income. And this is actually the income over the entire century. You can see at the beginning, under British rule, the poorest 50% actually were getting around 20%, between 15 and 20% of the income. It has gone down in recent decades, whereas the top 10%, their income has gone up, massively so in the last few decades. Now, this led, for example, 10 years ago to Amartya Sen asking, why does India not have a universal healthcare system? Economic growth has gone up between 5 and 8%. The country is much, much richer, but the distribution is not good. And he wrote this article saying, why can't India instigate a national health service, universal healthcare? And it is quite interesting because, surprisingly, Sri Lanka has had one since 1951. Of course, it's fallen apart in recent years with conflict, civil war, and COVID, and so on. But they, an economy that is not so different, felt that it was possible to have that from the beginnings of the post-colonial period. So what's going on? Does economic growth, does wealth from oil help? Well, we can see here that it does not necessarily. So Amnesty considers that 2 million people were evicted in that 10-year period, around which the country benefited from nearly $400 billion of oil revenue. I haven't got the exact periods matched up, but you can get the story. So this is a country which has squandered its oil wealth because it's not for the benefit of people. It is for the benefit of a corrupt and usually a dictatorial elite. Here are the poverty figures again from the World Bank. So this is 95 million people in Nigeria live in extreme poverty. Famously, 5 years ago at the Davos Forum, there's the URL there at the bottom. Watch it if you can, because Rutgers had a go at the wealthy. 1,500 private jets flew there. Incidentally, a few months ago, one of the richest billionaires in India had a wedding for his son, in which about 300 private jets flew in from all over the world. And I think the lead, well, I can't remember, a popular singer was hired. Was it Rihanna? Or somebody will tell me, I know, in the chat, because I probably got that wrong, because I'm too old to know pop singers. But here is the world elite discussing climate change in a way which is not very helpful. So my argument is that climate change is perceived very often as a narrative by the so-called global south. Oh, we are one of the worst affected countries in the world. Probably half the papers I read about Bangladesh says Bangladesh is the worst affected country in the world by climate change. Well, if I have time to go on to the case study, I'll show you that actually climate change has not significantly affected Bangladesh so far. It will, but the country has been for well over a decade making claims that they are badly affected because it's very convenient to blame climate change rather than the system which impoverishes people and makes them vulnerable in that country. So all of these things now are blamed on climate change, even by very well-educated people that I meet and talk to almost every year, when they are actually, some of them, natural processes, and certainly where climate change can be an attribution, it is very minor at the moment. So there is a very poor understanding, even amongst the educated elite in Bangladesh and other countries, about what the existing problems are, including migration, where we have another huge guilt-tripped discussion of so-called climate migrants and climate refugees and so on, which again, we can come back to if you want to in the discussion. But underlying all this is the lack of any desire to explain why people are poor and vulnerable already. All of these approaches are aimed at avoiding having to explain why people are poor and vulnerable, because that's embarrassing. And it would mean explaining that the system under which the people live is exploitative. It causes poverty, or the government oversees systems which generate poverty and vulnerability to disasters. And, well, the elite benefits from this narrative. The elite in both the so-called North and the South benefits from this narrative, because the global North needs to be able to pretend it is going to help the global South to deal with climate change. in very restricted ways. So climate change becomes the narrative, even when it is not. So a couple of last year, I think, I was asked to referee a paper which had this title, which you can see it highlights climate change there. And nothing I read in this paper, which was a very interesting paper, had any serious implication in relation to climate change. So in the end, I said, can you find the climate data for where you are working? And so eventually they found this data for rainfall in a weather station quite close to their research site. And as you can see, there's no indicator there in annual rainfall. Of course, the variability might have increased, but they were talking about flooding, not variability. There's no indication there that climate change has any impact on rainfall there at all. And they were attributing in this paper flooding to climate change. And I could see from their paper very clear ideas of what was related to power and other factors which were causing it. And then this book came out a few years ago by Dewan. And you see that she's put climate change in the title. Initially, she didn't think it was relevant, but she talked to somebody, as you can see on the right. He commented on the increasing amount of financial support for climate change and proposed that the title should include and should mention climate change, which she didn't want to do, but she did. And this narrative is the one that is used all the time, of course, to access funding. And the Bangladesh government and many other governments want to access this funding. Now, we also know that the floods in Pakistan 2 years ago began the process by which Pakistan's government started blaming climate change. And in a way which was some of it very misleading. Here are some of the ways in which the flood damage was highlighted, with the claim that 1/3 of the country was underwater, which was wrong, just wrong. And this figure came from the minister related to climate change. And she had been using very misleading data, which had been on the basis that they reported counties that had some flooding, and 1/3 of the counties had had some flooding. That did not mean that 1/3 of the country was underwater. It was much less. As you can see here in 2022, the extent of the flooding, nowhere near 1/3 of the country. And it was not very different from the floods of 2010, which you probably remember, where interestingly, the Pakistan government at that stage did not invoke climate change as a cause. The rain fell much more in the north, in the left-hand side in 2010, and made its way down the valley, whereas the rainfall was much more over the lower part of the river in the 2022 ones. And it's quite difficult to attribute the 2022 to climate change, but it was a very convenient narrative for the government to blame climate change and therefore the global north and seek funding. So I'm going to stop there without using the case study. I can come to it if you want. But I do reiterate, I would love to have your comments and messages afterwards. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. And look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Terry. That was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. I will stop our recording now.